Hello, everybody. First of all, I'd just like to thank the organisers of this event for allowing me to contribute remotely in these strange times. My paper will focus on and examine Hardy's disillusion of the human-natural divide in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles rests somewhere in between the concepts of romanticism and naturalism. It takes aspects of both styles in order to craft a novel that places great emphasis on the relationship between and the interconnectedness of humanity and the natural world, yet it never fully commits to the schools of thought that this interconnectedness represents. Hardy resists the naturalistic tendency to reduce human individual experience to insignificancy in his undeviating preoccupation with Tess and her troubles. Yet his indulgence of the naturalistic idea of man's affinity with animals and the natural world is palpable throughout. Similarly, his presentation of the relationship between nature and man often falls within more romantic parameters, particularly in his use of pathetic fallacy, natural symbolism, and superstition. But this is not the sympathetic and optimistic relationship that many of the romantics imagined. Rather, Hardy continually jumps between naturalistic and romantic views of nature. In David Lodge's words, Hardy's ambiguous treatment of nature throughout Tess might be formulated as his inability to decide whether the pathetic fallacy was fallacious or not. This inconsistency is not a fault with the narrative, but an accurate reflection of Tess's own troubled beliefs surrounding the natural world, something I will argue is not fully reconciled until the final chapters of the novel, wherein the divide between her characterization and that of nature is finally dissolved and they become one. For the purpose of this paper, I will be relying on the Cambridge Dictionary definition of nature, which encompasses all of the features, forces, and processes that happen or exist independently of people, including plants, animals, the weather, and naturally occurring landscapes. This, I would suggest, is reminiscent of Hardy's understanding of the term, given his liberal use of it, both in its usual and capitalized form, without centering it upon any singular aspect of the natural world. In the narrative world of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, nature is initially recognizable through its distinction from humanity, but as the narrative develops, this line becomes increasingly blurred until the antonym of nature transitions from human to society. And it is this distinction that I'm going to explore. Of course, this leaves a lot of ground to cover, so this paper will focus predominantly on a few key moments and the ways in which Hardy conveys this gradual dissolution through his characterization of Tess. From the outset of the novel, we can see hints of the transition that's going to take place through the liminal nature of the primary locations. Marlet, for example, is portrayed as a village that resides on the boundary between society and the natural world. It's situated in a secluded region, for the most part untrodden as yet by tourist or landscape paper. Yet it is concurrently only a 4 hours journey from London. The village is located on a border, and the result is a population that could go either way. And this is encapsulated by the stark difference between Tess and the other girls of the village that is evident almost immediately. They are all genuine country girls, unaccustomed to many eyes, but only Tess actively shies away from Angel, a clear representation of a man fully immersed in societal life at that point. At multiple points throughout the narrative, Tess displays a resistance to leave her rural life, while her companions do not exhibit this desire so explicitly. This is further shown by how Tess's physical characterization is so deeply grounded in natural imagery. While her peers are imbued with beautiful features, Tess's, although charming, are more centered around her affinity with nature. Her mouth is a peony, and her large, innocent eyes have the aspect of a wild animal. The result of these descriptors is a heroine that can slip seamlessly into the natural world of the narrative. She does not stand out in these natural settings like the other village girls do. As a group, the sun lights up their figures against the green hedges, forming a juxtaposition between the two. But as a singular being, Tess possesses the ability to blend into the wildlife, becoming invisible against natural backdrops, particularly in the chase and other similar wooded areas. This device is further exemplified through Hardy's use of animal doubles throughout the novel. They appear regularly, with Alec's horse Tib reflecting his aggression, Mrs. d'Urberville's birds depicting the freedom that she cannot indulge herself, and the cows of the dairy representing the restraint of the milkmaids. It is Tess, however, that has the most animal doubles by far, with almost every episode featuring a comparable creature. The first and most significant example of this is the family horse, Prince. In literature, the concept of the double often centres upon a figure that encompasses the familiar and the unfamiliar by presenting a different version of oneself, one that has been suppressed by either the individual or their surroundings. In Hardy's case, his animal doubles present versions of his characters that are fundamentally unbridled by society, or at least they should be. Alec and Mrs. d'Urberville's animalistic doubles adhere to this paradigm, but Prince is a creature that has been claimed by humanity and forced to act outside of his nature in a way that is reminiscent of Tess's later deposition into the world of the d'Urbervilles. Prince's abrupt awakening to go out and labour at an hour when every living thing was intended to be in shelter and at rest foreshadows Tess's obligation to go out and labour at her ancestral household, and both of these actions have similarly destructive implications for their sufferers. Prince's death can easily be interpreted as a physical manifestation of Tess's fall from grace that will soon occur. At the most basic level, Prince's death entails the loss of her family's means of income, so Tess is obliged to work for the d'Urbervilles. This thereby commences the tragic chain of events that will culminate in her own death, but there is more to it than just this. The phallic image of the pointed shaft that kills Prince and spills his lifeblood mirrors both the wound that Alec inflicts upon Tess in forcibly taking her virginity, and the wound she inflicts upon him at the climax of the novel. John Hummer claims that in deflowering Tess, Alec draws her virginal blood, physically wounding her as Prince is wounded here. But while Prince's death is relatively quick, Tess's will be drawn out for another few hundred pages. Her attempts to staunch his bleeding by putting her hand upon the hole serves only to stain her from face to skirt in crimson drops, as if she is marked for death from the very moment that her animal double draws his last breath. Prince and Tess are victims of a society that is not designed for them. Tess is a child of the soil, trapped in the confines of societal expectations rather than the natural laws that the narrator deems more appropriate for her. Neither Prince's death nor Tess's violation of societal convention impede anyone outside of the Derby fields, and the world moves on without them. Prince's lifeblood is quickly scratched and scraped over by the passing vehicles, and Tess's cries in the chase go unheeded. The anthropomorphism of nature and zoomorphism of humanity are effective methods by which to reflect the fragile boundary between the two, and it is not unique to the motif of animal doubles. We see human-like depictions of nature throughout the novel, most notably in the passage wherein Miss d'Urberville's birds appear to collude with the ivy to stage a parasitic invasion of the household, walking around as though the place had been built by themselves, reclaiming a man-made creation for nature. This is exemplified further when Tess describes the daily presentation of each bird to Mrs. d'Urberville as a confirmation, wherein she was the bishop and the young Vause, the young people presented to him. This acts as a parallel image to that which we saw with Prince earlier in the text. Rather than being ensnared into human society, the birds are apparently appropriating it for themselves. This seemingly bizarre image works to highlight the ways in which humans do the same to nature. An example being the religious enthusiast that Tess encounters painting Christian dogma against the peaceful landscape. Just as this fanatic forces human doctrine into nature, nature also begins to infiltrate human society within the novel. Another significant way that Hardy shows nature forcing its way into human affairs is, of course, through natural omens. Hardy implements these both subtly, like the paint mark that stains Tess's skirt in a way that recalls Prince's blood earlier, and explicitly, with the afternoon crow precursing the revelation of her shame. The issue with Hardy's nature having this level of preoccupation with humanity, however, is that it leads Tess to assume that everything she sees in the natural world is a reflection of or caused by her actions. The narrator makes it clear that this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the way that nature functions and a mistaken creation of Tess's fancy. Tess sees herself as a figure of guilt intruding into the haunts of innocence, a statement that clearly assumes everything in nature is innocent. As a societally constructed term, innocence does not exist within nature or the animal kingdom, unless humanity imposes the label onto a creature or object within it. Therefore, Tess is not corrupting the goodness she sees around her. In fact, she's having no effect at all. She's simply imagining a distinction where there was no difference. But she's not the only character to make this mistake. Angel too conflates virginity, purity, and nature whenever he refers to Tess's purity. He sees her as a fresh and virginal daughter of nature, but he doesn't realize that virginal and natural are not synonymous until much later in the narrative. As our narrator points out, both Tess and Angel see her in antagonism with nature when she's actually in accord. She may have broken an accepted social law, but nature recognizes no such measure of morality. Angel feels deceived by nature, who, in her fantastic trickery, had set a false seal of maidenhood upon Tess. But it's not until they both realize the fallacy with these assumptions that they can truly understand nature. It's at this point that the boundary between humanity and nature begins to break down, and Tess can begin to view herself not as a vilified member of society, but as a mistreated creature of nature. The most profound example of this is, of course, the eminent scene in which Tess finds refuge in a forest and wakes up to find herself surrounded by dead or dying birds that had temporarily survived a hunting party, all of them writhing in agony except the fortunate ones whose tortures had ended during the night by the inability of nature to bear more. It's at this moment that Tess fully comprehends man's kinship to the creatures sprawled around her, as she muses upon how anyone could inflict this upon their weaker fellows in nature's teeming family. Not only does Tess see herself as reminiscent of the birds, her kindred sufferers, but she even views their killers as traitors to nature's family. Tess may still feel the guilt she associates with her shameful history, but she acknowledges that her pain is nothing compared to the unfathomable misery that surrounds her. I be not mangled, she declares, I be not bleeding. This scene also marks the first time she explicitly agrees with that which the narrator has been proclaiming from the beginning of the novel. Her crime and her sense of shame stems only from an arbitrary law of society that has no foundation in nature. This is a moment of revelation for Tess and reflects her ultimate acceptance of nature's law over that of mankind. One has forsaken her over and over, while the other provides comfort and shelter for all until humanity decides to infiltrate it and destroy weaker fellows of their natural families. Previously, Tess has been consistently portrayed as more in tune with nature than those around her, but now this is fully substantiated, as sleeping under the trees becomes a safer and more desirable prospect than returning to the society she has been villainized in and expelled from. This final realization is substantiated in Tess's final scene, wherein she and Angel arrive at Stonehenge. Despite the structure being man-made, this location is presented as even closer to nature than the previous rural settings because it exists outside of human society and religion. Angel's claim that the sacrificial altars were intended not for God, but for offerings to the sun, underlines this distance from societal laws that Tess has been suffering under, and upon learning this, she instantly relaxes and lays down on the altar as a demonstration of her own final sacrificial act. Not to God, not to society, but to the sun, to nature. This is the only moment in the novel that Tess can be described as completely at peace. In offering herself up to nature in this dramatic display, she can relinquish all of the constraints that society has entrapped her in. It does not matter to Tess that her physical death will be via execution, because in her mind, she's already surrendered herself to nature and thus finally dissolved the boundary between humanity and the natural world. I just want to say one more time, thank you to the organisers for allowing me to participate remotely, and I hope the rest of the conference goes well. Thank you.